Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I head the committee responsible for these broadcasts. In 1981, the United Nations resolved that the third Tuesday in September be designated an International Day of Peace. The day was to be devoted to strengthening the ideal of peace, educationally and emotionally. In 2001, the day of observance was changed to September 21. In 2019, Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods decided to devote a portion of its September programming to peace and formed a committee to develop peace-related programming. In that spirit, as part of our September 2021 Peace Observance, Concerned Citizens is pleased to bring you Vivian Klesak, a member of Concerned Citizens Peace Committee, in an interview with a longtime advocate for peace, Michael Myerson. Welcome, Vivian.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here today. Concerned Citizens is an organization that represents the highest values. And I'm honored today to interview Michael Myerson, who has described himself in a couple of interesting ways. The child of a blacklisted set designer under McCarthyism, and much later as an adult, a non-communist, pro-American, pro-human. And Michael, you've been part of, actually since you were a child, since you were an infant, some of those significant human rights and peace movements in our culture. Your mother was the president of the League for Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Your parents were both oppressed under McCarthyism and won a suit against the Los Angeles Police Department for harassment. That's pretty unique. So tell me a little bit about growing up in that life. What was it like for you?
Well, it was, for me, it was the normal way of growing up because it's the only way I knew of growing up. I had nothing to compare my childhood except to my friends who I had no idea what their internal life was like. Being an 8-year-old kid who gets visited by the FBI, or junior high school kid who gets called into the principal's office for another interview with the FBI, I guess it scars you. I up until my 30s or so, I had FBI chase dreams. We were just an ordinary family. My mother was very active in the peace movement, meaning at that time trying to stop atmospheric nuclear testing. There was a Stockholm peace appeal that in this country was headed by Professor Linus Pauling at Caltech, and she kind of coordinated that campaign in Southern California, the petition gathering. It was an international campaign. My dad was working in the Hollywood studios, and like a lot of hundreds of other people, not just, everybody knows about the Hollywood 10 screenwriters and directors, but there were hundreds, maybe thousands of set designers, costume designers, grips, electricians, and so on, who were also blacklisted. My dad was one of them. And consequently, he became unemployed for a year and a half, and my mom went to work graveyard shift, working at Southern Pacific as a stenographer. You mentioned the suit with the Los Angeles police. That came much later. In sometime in the early 70s, my dad had retired, and he was like to go to fill up his retirement hours going to court, being a courtroom observer. And he became quite familiar with the police and police conduct. And there was a campaign. Sorry about that. There was a campaign. That was my wife's phone. I took my phone out. There was a campaign for police reform, and my dad became active in there. It was also at the time of the Angela Davis case, and my dad became active in the committee to defend Angela Davis. And around that same time, we had rocks thrown through our windows. I was living in New York, but my parents' house had rocks thrown through the windows. Their tires were slashed, and so on. And at one point, one morning, my dad was taking a shower. His grandson, my nephew Lincoln, who's Latifah's son, probably was 10 or 12 years old at the time, and there was somebody at the door, and he looked out the window and went into the shower room to tell my dad that police are at the door. So my dad came out in a bathrobe and looked through the window, and there was a shotgun staring at him with a police other side saying, "Come on out with your hands up." And he came outside. There were several police cars around there, and all the neighbors were out. My dad's in his bathrobe. They made him get down on his knees and put his hands behind his back and all that. And then they ransacked the house, saying they were looking for weapons that he brought back from Cuba. He had gone to Cuba as a carpenter on a Vince Ramos brigade. These were groups mainly of young people who went to create U.S.-Cuban friendship. They harvested sugar and built polyclinics and so on. Obviously, didn't bring back weapons from Cuba, and if he had, they would have been intercepted at the airport. But so my parents sued the police department. It turned out that they were the ones, the Ramparts precinct, which is our precinct and notorious in Los Angeles for brutality, had a red squad, and turned out that they had been the ones who were slashing the tires and throwing rocks through the windows and so on. So the end of the story is my parents sued, got a settlement of, I think it was $30,000, something like that, which they made as a contribution to the peace organizations. That was turns out it wasn't such a normal childhood. But I don't regret it. I was proud of my parents, and it taught me a lot about how the criminal justice system works, and generally how the system works, and who's powerful, and how power is used against ordinary citizens that complain about the way power is used.
That's a really important point, that ordinary citizens can find themselves suddenly the victim of power, and people who are just trying to do their job, be a good person. But if they are somehow defined by a group like the Ramparts as not okay, they can be blindsided, literally. That's what happened to your father. When did you first begin to feel your oats as a radical activist?
When I first began to be active myself, as a child, but my father was on picket lines. I would join him as a kid and so on. But in terms of really taking an active part in political action, I went to Berkeley in 1958, and there was a emerging student organization, a campus political party called Slate, which didn't stand for anything, but it ran a slate of candidates in student elections. But it also was very active on a host of issues, trying to get rid of ROTC on campus. Carol Chessman was on death row, and we became active against the death penalty. When the Un-American Activities Committee came to San Francisco, we demonstrated, and about 150 of us were washed down the steps of City Hall in San Francisco in a kind of iconic moment for people of that generation. And I was the head of Slate as the president of Slate for 2 years, and never stopped being active in the, whatever it is, the 60 years since then.
I remember the picture of Slate. I was a high school student in Colorado, just beginning to discover social action and politics. And I remember that picture. I believe you were easily identified in that picture. Is that correct?
I was in a whole number of pictures.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which one that is. When the Vietnam War started, the Vietnam War really started for the United States in 1961 with the introduction of advisors. And that was when I had just graduated from Cal, and but I was also I had been drafted, and as a draft resistor, I refused to sign the loyalty oath. And so there were the Army intelligence. I couldn't hold a job. Every time I had a job, the Army intelligence would come on the job and I'd get fired. And finally, Harry Bridges, who's the president of the West Coast Longshore Union, heard about me and got me a job working on the waterfront. So, which he said, "You're not going to get fired from this." Wasn't. And during that time, I had active leading demonstrations around civil rights, trying to. There were all white hiring practices in the hotel industry in San Francisco, in Automobile Row, the car showrooms, restaurants, and so on. And we had demonstrations, a lot of sit-ins. Hundreds of us got arrested again. So I became kind of a poster boy. And so there are a lot of pictures. I'm not sure which ones you're talking about, but yeah, I had a lengthy arrest record.
You had an arrest record?
Yeah.
A proud one, I think.
I keep getting arrested. I got arrested 4 years ago in North Carolina. They have Reverend Barber. I don't know if any of you know.
Yes, yes.
Barber, but he conducted Moral Monday demonstrations at the state legislature and started out with 20 people getting arrested, but every Monday. And then I went down and I was arrested. And then probably, I don't know how, a couple of thousand people were arrested by that time. Anyway, it's what I do.
So you have a proud arrest record.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Don't regret any of it. I've led a blessed life. I feel lucky in my friends, in my family, in the things I've done, the people I've met along the way.
I read in your biography that you graduated from Berkeley and then you got kicked off campus. How did that happen?
Well, I didn't get kicked off campus. My Slate got kicked off campus.
They got kicked off campus.
Yeah. What happened? They had this absurd rule that campus organizations could not talk about non-campus issues. So Vietnam was a non-campus issue. Capital punishment was a non-campus issue, and so on. It turned out the issue they were concerned about was housing in Berkeley, which had been strictly segregated, in which we there was a bill in the city council for open housing, which Slate supported, and the dean of students at that time was running for city council against open housing, and conveniently found that we were addressing a off-campus issue, and it kicked the organization off campus.
So there's not an issue of importance to a group like Concerned Citizens that you haven't been part of.
Yeah, well, they're all related. I mean, for me, I don't find a contradiction. And, you know, like I say, I've been doing this for many, many years. And I'm not the only one. And I will run into people at a demonstration who I knew from an environmental protest or an anti-apartheid demonstration or whatever the issue was. People see the links. And once you get active, you see the links. Not everybody does, but for the most part, because you're fighting for human rights and justice and peace, and I don't know how they're divisible.
So the core issues are human rights, justice, and peace, and they come up in specific issues like housing or women's rights, but they're
Right.
all about creating a society based on these values that we all want.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think one of the problems with American society, maybe it's not unique to the United States, but it's certainly true here, and maybe especially true with the new technologies and the internet, is that people become atomized and they live in separated from one another and see and makes it difficult to feel one's own power. And actually, unless you're Michael Bloomberg or Jeff Bezos, the individual doesn't have real power. And real power comes from community and banding together and organizations. And from childhood, we were taught you can't fight City Hall because that's an argument that's put out by City Hall. It doesn't want you to fight City Hall, and you can't do it unless you find like-minded people to do it. And one of the ways that people are separated is that you have the women's movement over here and the environmental movement over there and the peace movement over there and so on. And that's what they try to do. They're successful at it, or they're not entirely successful at that.
So that whole issue of how we build community comes again and again, because in community there is strength. In your experience, what are the beginning ways to build community?
Pete Seeger, who I assume people watching this have heard of,
Yes, we have.
was a neighbor and a friend, wrote a song, which I'm not going to sing it for you, which would embarrass me and hurt your ears, but what the chorus is, inch by inch, row by row, that's the way a garden grows.
Mm.
And you know, you can form community, well, you form community in Laguna Woods, which you all have successfully done. I don't know much about it, but that's one community. And then multiply that by 10,000, because there are at least 10,000 such communities around the country, and you have a much greater community.
Inch by inch. So it begins really with looking within ourselves, talking to our neighbors, and slowly building that sense of we are not that different.
Yeah. And taking a big step of going public with it, and so that you're not just confined to a living room of friends, but you find yourself at wherever, at a shopping center, gathering petition signatures or whatever the action might be.
And not being afraid to stand up for what you believe in.
Yeah, or even if you are afraid to stand up for what you believe in. I think my own definition of bravery has nothing to do with being afraid or not being afraid. It's overcoming fear or doing something in spite of fear.
I think that's true. You can't be brave.
It's okay to be afraid because there's scary stuff out there. The thing is to overcome the fear.
You can't be brave unless you're afraid.
Yeah.
You're not afraid, bravery,
Right.
I'm into it. You wrote a book, The Coming of Age as a Radical in America's Late years. What does that mean, late years?
Well, I've written several books. That was the first book I wrote, and it's kind of arrogant. It was my memoirs, which I wrote at the age of 27 or 20.
Got it.
And it talks about some of the stuff I've just described to you. But what happened is I was taking a course at New York University from it was called The Literature of Social Protest, and the professor was actually editor of Viking Press, and he and I became friends in the course of that, and at the end of which he says, you should write a book about yourself. So this is the book I wrote about myself. And from then on, didn't consider myself a writer, but I became a writer. So I've written a few books and a gazillion magazine articles and lots of ghostwriting speeches and stuff.
So part of your activism has been standing in a picket line, getting arrested, and also writing, telling the story and offering up ideas.
Yes, indeed.
Tell me something about your other books. What are some of the books that have been really important to you?
After that book, my second book was, it was about Watergate. It's called Watergate: Crime in the Suites. And then there's a book I wrote. I had gone to Cuba, spent some time there, particularly with filmmakers, and I wrote a book about Cuban film called Memories of Underdevelopment. And then there was a case in the 1970s of a group of young teenagers, mainly civil rights activists in Wilmington, North Carolina, who were arrested. They were called the Wilmington 10, led by a young 26 or 27-year-old United Church of Christ minister, Reverend Ben Chavis. And they were arrested and sentenced for, there was a group called the Rights of White People, a terrorist organization, links to the Marine base at Camp Lejeune that had blown up a church in Wilmington, and these young people were arrested and sentenced for arson and so on, sent to prison. I went down to write about it. I was going to write a 4-page pamphlet and ended up spending about a better part of 3 or 4 years there, and wrote a book called Nothing Could Be Finer. Out about that case, but it became like a anthropology of the so-called New South about North Carolina. Then I wrote a book. In the 80s, I was the full-time director of an organization called U.S. Peace Council, and I wrote a book called Stopping World War III about the nuclear arms race. And I'm sure I missed a book or two in there. Anyway.
I want to hear more about the U.S. Peace Council. What kinds of activities did you engage in? How did you build community in the council?
Well, we tried to be the disarmament movement at that time was predominant. It was very powerful, very effective, wonderful people, but it was wasn't exclusively, but predominantly white and middle class, and also had nose to the grindstone about nuclear disarmament, but that didn't want to touch other issues. And so we tried to do something different. We tried to build a multiracial organization. Actually, a member of our board is now getting celebrated as being the only member of Congress to oppose the Afghanistan war, Barbara Lee.
Barbara Lee, yeah.
So we were a multi-racial organization, and the way we did that I don't know what came first, but because we did not stick to only to nuclear disarmament, but we talked about military budget, its effect on schools and communities and jobs, and so we had a number of. We were also a mixed class organization, a number of trade unionists and working class people, and we also connected the questions of peace to, at that time, very active anti-colonial struggles in Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, the movement to liberate the Portuguese colonies, and so on and so forth. We actually started a petition campaign in 1981 to free Nelson Mandela, who at that time was considered a terrorist by the United States government. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, we gathered about 500,000 signatures, which of course most Americans never heard of Mandela. So that was the kind of organization we were. And we were also instrumental, I don't know if you remember, in 1982, on June 11th, 1982, we put 1 million people into Central Park during the United Nations Special Session on Disarmament. 1 million people came out for nuclear freeze. It was the largest demonstration in one place in US history. I think it probably still is the case.
So you've had quite a life. Yeah.
It's been fun. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm happy with the life I lived.
Well, you lived a life based on.
And I'm still living.
You lived a life based on basic core values of human. Last year, the United Nations said the theme for International Peace Day was shaping peace together. And I think your story, your work, your writing, your activism, your organizing, that is all about shaping peace together, building that togetherness around all the issues that are core.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm not a religious person. I don't even. Both my brothers are I don't know if they're religious, but they're both spiritual. I don't know if I could even consider myself a spiritual person, but I do believe that doing this kind of work, at least in my case, gives me a sense of inner peace. I mean, I, like every other human, have flaws and faults and have done things wrong. But when the car comes to pick me up for my final journey, I won't have any regrets. So
I think shaping peace together, the kind of work you have done your whole life, is a spiritual journey. I can't imagine a more powerful way of expressing our higher selves.
yeah, and well, thank you. I mean, I think that's probably true. And I have, I have no differences with my brothers and a gazillion other people who are religious or spiritual. I mean, I feel part of their family, even though I'm not. I don't attend family functions.
It sounds like you have an interesting family, and we have a connection, Concerned Citizens, through Latifa, who introduced us to you. And Latifa and your brother, I think Alan, were part of the committee in San Francisco in the 60s, which I remember when I was a student at Stanford, going to demonstrations and seeing the committee. And then it was a joy to find Latifa here, who's one of our leading activists for Peace Day and Concerned Citizens. And so your whole family has that wonderful history.
Yeah. Well, you're lucky to have Latifa. I was I may embarrass her if I'm sure she's watching this, but when she and my brother got married, there was a small wedding in a Washington Square in Greenwich Village Church. It was the two of them and Alan Arkin and myself. Alan Arkin and Latifa were college classmates and friends. And then my brother Alan, before he and Latifa started the committee, was the director of Second City, and Alan Arkin was one of the actors in Second City, and that's they were all part of the same community.
I think most of our generation remembers Second City and the committee using theater, using art and improvisation and humor to talk back to the establishment.
Yeah. They after this is over and the Laguna Woods group finishes watching this, you can ask Latifa more about that. But she's quite a talented and dedicated person.
Yeah, well, she's one of the heart-centered people who create Peace Day here in Laguna Woods. So
And she gave me my favorite nephew.
Right now, we have a hard time in our society with great polarization and hostility and quote alternative facts. Where do you see hope? How do we begin to move forward?
Look at the kids. I mean, that's what I do. I mean, a lot of those activities I talked about earlier in this discussion, I did when I was a kid. I mean, I was 18, 20, 24, 28, whatever. And today, if you look at what young people are doing, they're leading the way. And the sunshine, the sunrise movement, the young environmental people, they're the leading force in the environmental movement. It's always been that way in the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the Black Lives Matter, whatever organizations are led by young people. They're brilliant at it, and because they, unlike us, are not only familiar with but expert with their fingers in social media, they're able to do things that were inconceivable to me when I was a kid. And I look at the young people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jamal Bowman and Mondaire Jones and Cori Bush and the young people in Congress. I have two kids who of that generation. My daughter is a farmer in Point Reyes, up the coast from San Francisco, and is devoted to the land and to the environment, and she's doing terrific stuff. And my son is a freelance political radical. He's right now in Buffalo, New York, a young meaning in her 30s, nurse, African-American nurse, who's a socialist, beat a 4-term Democratic incumbent in the Democratic primary for mayor. She's slated to become the next mayor of Buffalo. The guy she defeated was not only a 4-term incumbent, but the chair of the New York Democratic Party. And my son is her communications chief. So, and he was at Occupy. I mean, he was in the beginning of the Occupy Wall Street movement 10 years ago. So where I see hope, I'm not at all discouraged. I mean, there's reasons to be discouraged. I know what we're up against and so on, but when was that ever not the case?
Well, I'm glad to hear that the hope continues in the next generation. I heard a panel of young people saying that they don't need the leaders that we needed, like Martin Luther King and Mandela. They don't want that figure who somehow embodies that they believe in a much more egalitarian community movement. What's your sense of that?
Well, I think there may be a misreading of who Mandela was, because he never was a handed down orders. That's not how the African National Congress worked. But there is a I think it's a healthy attitude against elites and top-down leadership and anti-authoritarianism within our movements. On the other hand, you won't have a movement, or you can't sustain a movement without organization. And organization requires, by the nature of organizations, is a structure and coordination and leadership. And leadership doesn't mean directing orders, but it mean, I don't think anybody marched behind Dr. King because he was a general. He was a man of peace, and he articulated the hopes of millions of people, and they followed him. But it wasn't. There were no orders being handed down.
I think what I heard from some of these young people was they didn't want to give one person the attention and symbolic identity, that they wanted it to be a group activity. And what you're saying is that leadership requires organization, and organization requires somebody taking that mantle of leadership. So how do you avoid one person becoming deified? I don't mean exactly.
The thing is that, I mentioned Mandela and King, but Mandela and King, because they're the best known of those movements, but they weren't the only leaders of those movements. And in the Southern movement, you had Bob Moses in Mississippi, and John Lewis, and Diane Nash in Nashville, and there are lots of leaders. And when Mandela went to prison for life, he went to prison with 11 others, and after that, 13 others, and after that, 26 others. And so these are not one-person organizations or movements. They're often characterized as that. I was in Berkeley for the free speech movement in 1964 now, and happened kind of spontaneously. There's a guy named Jack Weinberg who was handing out flyers for a civil rights demonstration, which I was very much in leadership of in Oakland, California, and the police stopped him from doing that on campus and put him in a police car. And a young student named Mario Savio, who wasn't part of any organization, stood up on the car and to try to prevent it. And then people gathered, and soon there were 1,000 students around it, and a beginning of a movement. And Mario, who was particularly articulate, became well known as the spokesman of free speech movement, but he wasn't. There was no spokesman. There had a leadership. There's a graduate student group. So a lot of this is how the media portrays people, but it's not a picture of the people. They prefer to focus on one person because that's the best way they can understand what's going on. But it's also the way that they don't understand what's going on.
Well, that's well said. And it's encouraging to know that we're not dependent on, quote, the leaders. The other thing in our culture that has been powerful, I was watching recently the HBO documentary about Obama, and that was such a period of hope. And I remember him saying, there is no Black America, there is no white America, there's only the United States of America. And now it appears that we have these powerful polarized factions. How do you see us moving through that?
Yeah, well, I think Obama was wrong. I think he was wrong. I'm not clear he is wrong, because there is, he also said there are no blue states, there are no red states.
Right.
Well, were that it were so, but it's not. I think the polarization is in large part, or at least in significant part, that the rise of the open racist, white supremacist, fascist right, which now characterizes the significant, maybe the major part of the Republican Party, was a response to the fact that for the first time there was a Black president. And this was people, in Charlottesville when they had the Nazi rally 4 years ago, where Trump found some very fine people on both sides. Their main slogan was "Jews shall not replace us."
I remember that.
This idea of replacement, and that's the appeal that this country has always been run by white people and white patriarchs, white men, and thus it shall always be. And nature is changing that. I mean, the fact is that in 10 years from now, this will be a minority white country. And that's allowed for people are insecure because for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, that they feel atomized, they're not they feel powerless, they're losing jobs, their kids are not, for this is the first generation where kids are going to have it tougher than their parents. It's always been, each generation has gotten it easier as a generation, not in individuals, but I mean, I was born in the golden age. Now my kids have it harder than I did. And people feel that, and so this is an appeal to them, to blame it on immigrants or to blame it on Muslims or Black people or whoever it might be blamed on, and that finds appeal because it finds a lot of appeal in the white church. And I have a thesis, which I have to do the research to prove it, but I believe it's the case that in 1965, when President Johnson signed the voting rights bill, he says that the Democratic Party has now lost the South for the next several generations, because the Democratic Party in the South was a white racist. By signing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Bill, they'd all go Republican, which they have and are still. Also, what happened then around that same time, especially after Brown versus the Board of Education, is whites pulled their children out of Southern schools and set up these all-white Christian academies. That is the birth of the modern white evangelical church, the Southern Baptist Church, and that can't be separated from this ecosystem, this white male supremacist ecosystem. That's who it is. I mean, Trump brought it all out. January 6th brought it all out, and it was always there. Now it's there in the open, and they feel happy to be in the open. But I do believe there's still a minority, and what needs to happen is the majority has to out-organize them and articulate them and fight them. Bring them dragging and screaming into the 21st century. Not going to be easy, and it's not going to, and it's not. Some of them can be won over, and some of them can't. Those who can't, you pass laws that, to make it illegal to have things. I mean, there are laws like against insurrection at the Capitol, and now a number of people were arrested and they're being tried. But that's just the beginning. Laws have to be enforced according to the law, not according to the whim of the local police department.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you talked to earlier of hope is in the youth. So many of this youth movement is outside the church. What about any movements within religions? Because some of these kids are growing up in a religious movement, maybe not that right-wing one, but how does that, and the church was an important part, obviously, of the civil rights movement. Is there a space where church or synagogue is also a positive force?
You've come to the wrong person. Yeah. It doesn't intend. I can't. That's not my. I mean, I do know. The Black church is still very active, and a lot of the movement. For the modern today civil rights movement still is in significant part based in the Black church. I know in the Jewish community, young people are the basis of organizations that are considered verboten by the official Jewish leadership. But groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, they're religious Jews, they're young Jews, but they're considered anti-Semitic by the official Jewish leadership because they're critical of Israel and its treatment of Palestinians.
So we see signs of change among young people in general. I think one of the interesting facts that we've learned during COVID is the countries that were doing the best were countries run by women. And the hypothesis was because these were leaders who not only had leadership skills and organization, but had a level of compassion. And I think maybe there's something to be seen in the women's movement that brings together some of these hopes for peace.
Well, I think so, but I would caution against making a blanket statement because there have been women prime ministers of India and Sri Lanka and Israel and so on have not been quite so. They're not all Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand or even Angela Merkel. I mean, there's not one kind of woman.
Well, that is true, but maybe there's
not one kind of female prime minister. But the point is well taken, and you have a hard time finding male prime ministers who are in the category of Jacinda Ardern also.
Well, maybe there's something to be said for that. The younger woman, as you said, the youth. I see that in families today where fathers are as much engaged with their kids as mothers are, and that simply didn't happen 20, 30 years ago. So maybe all these seeds are about a new generation emerging.
Yeah, well, the thing is that for young people, and I think this is probably even true for the young people who were born into conservative families, right-wing families even, gay rights is not really an issue for a lot of them. I mean, it's like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And they assume that this is a multinational country that I'm going to go to school. I'm going to have classmates who are of Mexican heritage or Filipino heritage or whatever. It's not a big deal. It's just it's an assumption like I'm also going to be born with my thumbs on my device, which was also not an assumption a generation ago. So it's things are changing. And I was talking a moment ago about young Jewish activists. Well, a generation ago, 20, 30 years ago, Israel was seen as a struggling young country which surrounded by enemies and had now it's the fourth or fifth largest military in the world. It's a small country, but huge military, very powerful. It's a threat to its neighbors. Its neighbors don't have anything like the wherewithal to threaten it. So young Jews don't buy that argument anymore. So like, prove it to me. And I see what you're doing when you're bombing Gaza and so on. A younger Jew will see that different than an older Jew. I'm talking generalizations here, because they grew up with different assumptions and different understanding.
So generational change obviously is
Yeah.
changing the future. We did not talk about climate change when I was young. I didn't learn about it.
Climate change and what?
We didn't talk about climate change. Now it's a pivotal issue. And
Yeah,
it's happening every day.
Yeah, it's growing up. Like I said, my mom as a child was collecting signatures against atmospheric nuclear testing. The nuclear war was the existential issue, still is. It's the one thing that threatened humanity, the existence. Now that's been joined by climate change. They're both threats against the planet and the people on the planet. And unless they're controlled, reduced, and eliminated, the future is dim. I think increasingly the young generation understands that. I think the young generation, in its great majority, understands that. It's up to the older people who don't understand to get out of the way.
Well, we do have the hope of the younger generation. And one of the things that makes me smile is groups like Concerned Citizens. And when I was reading about you, I saw that your mom lived to be 101. And
100, yeah.
she was an activist forever.
Yeah.
And I know that Sue and Latifah and others in Concerned Citizens were out there in front and hopefully inspiring our young people, our grandchildren, and the generation to come as they inspire us. I have a grandson who is now non-binary. I didn't know what non-binary was.
Yeah.
We know what that is. My mother didn't know what gay or lesbian was in her stage. So hopefully we're all going through the growth together, and certainly you embody a life well lived in every part of the peace and human rights mission.
Yeah, the beat goes on. If we can finally, I mean, there's a op-ed piece in the New York Times this Sunday by Greta Thunberg. I assume everybody knows who Greta is, with 3 of her other colleagues around the world. But I don't know if people know this, but the leading young person, Greta's main collaborator here in the United States, is the daughter of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. Her teenage daughter is Greta's collaborator here. But they say that the adults are great danger to us unless they start moving, and we've come a long way in I don't know how many millennia, how many millions of years since we crawled out of caves and so on, but and the young people today are the ones who are going to carry it forward, but we got to leave them a planet that they can carry it forward with.
The dialogue goes on, and more as we can connect with the youth and they with us, we can build those communities. And the shaping of peace means shaping peace together. And that's so important. So I'm very, very impressed with you and excited about this conversation. Just going through this, learning the history, hearing more about how you learned and grew, and then sharing the hope for the future is a good thing for us to do. We will be listening to this week several times and celebrating Peace Day on September 21st.
Okay, yeah, well, civil rights movement had from the Black church, used to tell people, you pass it on, and that's what it's all about, passing it on to new generations and to your neighbors.
I like that. Pass it on.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a really great interview. I've learned a lot and enjoyed the conversation. And we will share it with our Laguna Woods community and especially our concerned citizens community.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Greetings from New York, hot and humid New York.
Well, it's pretty cool here in California today.
Okay.
Thank you again.
All right, bye-bye.
Concerned citizens thanks Michael Myerson for sharing his life experience with us. And thanks Vivian Klesak for her splendid interviewing skills. And thanks the Peace Committee for selecting Mr. Myerson. And thanks you, our audience, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you for another inspiring program next time.